A medieval wall is still getting harder. Somewhere in an old cathedral or a country church, the pale mortar packed between the stones 800 years ago is, at this very moment, still slowly turning back into rock. It never truly stopped setting. The masons who mixed it are 40 generations in the ground. Their mortar is still curing, still knitting the wall a little tighter with every passing century. Now think about the concrete overpass you drove under this morning. It was poured 60 years ago, and it is already crumbling, shedding chunks onto the road, streaked with rust and rot. We built the stronger material. We have the science, the machines, the testing labs no medieval mason could dream of. And somehow the stuff we mix today dies in decades, while the stuff they mix by hand outlives entire empires. Worse than that, when we try to repair their walls with our better material, we are the ones who end up killing them. Tonight we are going to follow lime through its strange life, from a lump of burning rock to a wall that breathes, bends, and slowly turns itself to stone. We will build the whole method up the way a medieval mason did, one step at a time, and find the single thing they understood about it that we forgot, traded away for something harder, and are now paying for with the very buildings we love most. Start at the beginning, with a rock and a fire. The whole story of lime begins with limestone, or with chalk, which is really just a soft cousin of it. Both are among the most common stones on earth. Cliffs of it, hills of it, whole landscapes built of the stuff. On its own, it is quiet grey rock that does very little. But do one violent thing to it, and it wakes up. You burn it. Medieval builders stacked limestone in a great kiln with wood or coal and roasted it for days at a tremendous heat, hot enough to change the very substance of the stone, not merely warm it. Lime burning was hard, hot, dangerous work, tended day and night, and every stone town and cathedral site across medieval Europe had its kilns going. And out of that fire came something new and something dangerous. What comes out of the kiln is called quicklime, and quicklime is a hungry, unstable, aggressive thing. The fire has driven a gas out of the stone and left behind a substance that desperately wants it back. Quicklime will burn skin, touch it with a wet hand, and it heats up and eats at you. It pulls moisture straight out of the air. Stored badly, it can even start a fire. This is not a calm building material sitting in a bag. It is a rock that has been robbed of something and is frantic to steal it back from anything nearby. Which raises the obvious question. How do you build a peaceful, permanent wall out of something this violent? The answer is the next step, and it is a controlled explosion. You slake it. The mason takes that furious quicklime and adds water, and the reaction is genuinely alarming to watch. The mixture hisses and boils and steams, cracking and swelling and throwing off enough heat to scald a careless hand. It looks less like mixing mortar than like waking a monster. Men did this in pits, standing back from the violence, stirring the seething mass from a safe distance. But when the fury finally dies down, the violence has spent itself, and what is left behind is calm. A smooth, white, soft paste called slaked lime, or lime putty. The dangerous rock has been tamed into something you can smear between stones with a trowel. And now we have a new problem, the exact opposite of the last one. This putty is soft and wet and weak. Squeeze it in your hand, and it just moves. So how on earth does a soft white paste ever become part of a wall that stands for 1,000 years? This is the heart of the whole method, and it is one of the quietly beautiful facts in all of building. That soft paste, once it is packed into a wall and left open to the air, begins very slowly to turn back into stone. Remember the gas the fire drove out of the limestone at the very start. The mason never put it back. But the air all around the wall is full of it, and the slaked lime sitting in the joints, breathing that air day after day, slowly draws the gas back out of it and runs the whole reaction in reverse. grain by grain, from the surface inward, the soft paste knits itself into hard stone, into the same substance the limestone was made of in the first place. The mason, without knowing a single word of the chemistry, was running a complete circle. He took stone, burned it to a hungry powder, tamed it with water into a paste, packed it wet into a wall, and then let the open sky slowly turn it back into stone. The wall is not glued together with some clever paste. The wall is quietly, patiently becoming rock, but it becomes rock at its own unhurried pace, and this is where the medieval understanding starts to split away from ours. Turning back to stone is slow. The surface of a joint hardens in weeks, but the deeper interior can go on setting for years, for decades, and in a thick wall for centuries. To us, that sounds like a defect. We want things cured and finished by the end of the week. The medieval mason saw it in a completely different light, and he leaned into the slowness on purpose. He would slake his lime and then leave the putty to mature in a covered pit, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, because well-aged lime made smoother, stickier, stronger mortar. Patience was one of the ingredients, and the slow setting was not a weakness he merely put up with. It was bound up with the property that made these walls last, a property we have almost completely forgotten a building is even supposed to have. That property is breath. A lime wall is porous, riddled with countless tiny channels, and it lets water move through it as vapour and then escape. Think about what actually attacks and destroys an old building. Water. Rain driving into the face of the stone, damp rising up out of the ground, moisture creeping into the core of the wall. In a lime building, that water has a way out. It travels through the soft, open mortar and evaporates off the surface, so the wall is forever drying itself, breathing moisture out the way skin breathes off sweat. The mortar is deliberately made softer and more open than the stone around it, so it becomes the escape route, a set of lungs threaded all through the structure. A medieval wall is not a sealed box holding a war against the weather. It is a living, breathing thing that simply lets the weather pass through it and leave. And there is one more gift hidden inside that softness, the one that sounds the most like magic, but is really just plain good sense. Because the mortar is soft, it can move. Every building shifts a little over its life. The ground settles beneath it, timbers swell and shrink, the earth trembles, heat and cold push and pull at the stone year after year. A perfectly rigid wall meeting those forces has to crack somewhere, and the crack always tears through the weakest line it can find. In a lime building, the softest thing in the whole wall is the mortar, so the mortar takes the strain. It flexes, it gives, and when it does finally crack, it cracks in the cheap replaceable joint rather than the precious carved stone. Better still, loose lime carried in a trickle of rainwater can seep into a fine crack and set again as new stone, sealing the wound on its own. The wall bends instead of snapping, and it quietly mends its own small injuries. The softness that looked like weakness was the entire secret of its strength. If lime is this good, patient, breathing, self-mending, why on earth did we ever stop using it? Because a new material arrived that seemed to beat it on every number that was easy to measure. Its name was Portland cement, patented in the early 1800s, and it changed the built world almost overnight. Cement was everything lime was not. It set hard in hours instead of months. It was immensely strong, far stronger than any lime mortar. It was rigid, waterproof, cheap, and perfectly consistent, and you could mix and pour it by the ton without any craft at all. Cement built the modern age, the bridges and the towers and the highways, and for nearly all of that work, it was exactly the right choice. So naturally, being harder and stronger and faster, surely it had to be better for everything. Including, we assumed, for patching up the crumbling old lime buildings we had inherited from those primitive medieval hands. And that one assumption is the mistake now quietly wrecking historic buildings all over the world. Here is what actually happens when you repair a soft, breathing lime wall with hard, sealed modern cement. And it is the turn at the centre of this whole story. In a single stroke, you strip the wall of both of its great gifts. First, the cement cannot flex. When the building shifts, as every building must, the rigid cement refuses to give an inch, so the strain has nowhere to go except into the stone. The mortar is now harder than the stone around it, so it is the stone that cracks and crumbles instead of the joint. You have turned the entire design inside out. Second, and worse, the cement is waterproof. Water still finds its way into the wall, it always does, but now it cannot get back out through the sealed cement joints. So it goes hunting for the only soft, open path that remains: the stone itself. Moisture is driven out through the face of the stone, carrying dissolved salts with it, and as it dries, those salts crystallize and freeze and swell just beneath the surface, and they blow the face of the stone off in flakes and sheets. A carved stone that stood through 700 years of honest weather in lime can lose its whole surface within a few decades of being sealed up in cement. Angels and saints that watched over a doorway since the Middle Ages have dissolved into faceless lumps in a single human lifetime, not from age, but from the kindness of a modern repair. The repair does not protect the building. The repair quietly executes it. If watching a wall breathe and mend itself makes you want to put your own hands on this kind of history, you are not the first to feel it. That is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It begins with the medieval bakery collection, the practical recipes book for the dishes themselves, the sourdough manual for keeping a living leaven the old way, and the sourcing guide for finding real heritage grain. It is where the hands-on medieval guides live, and the bread is where the kitchen starts. It asks for the same slow, patient care these walls were built on. Now hold that image of the flaky, cement-choked wall, because it points straight at the thing we actually forgot. What we lost was never the recipe. We know exactly how lime works, down to the last reaction. What we forgot was the idea underneath it. We forgot that an old building is not meant to be a rigid, sealed fortress, holding the weather out by brute force. It is meant to be a soft, breathing, flexible thing that lets the weather move through it and leave, that bends rather than snapping, that sacrifices its cheap joints to spare its precious stone. The medieval mason understood a wall as something closer to a living body than a machine, a thing that had to breathe and move to stay alive. We arrived with a stronger, harder, faster material, decided that stronger and harder and faster had to mean better in every case, and began sealing those breathing bodies inside a waterproof skin. We were not being greedy, and we were not being stupid. We were simply trusting the reasonable modern instinct that more strength always means more safety. For a cathedral, that instinct turned out to be exactly backwards. And this is not some small or rare misfortune. Across Europe and far beyond it, countless historic churches, cottages, castles, farmhouses and bridges were repointed and coated in cement all through the 20th century, almost always in good faith, and they are now decaying faster because of it than they did in all the quiet centuries before. Undoing that mistake is slow, delicate, expensive work. Conservation bodies now send trained craftspeople to painstakingly rake the hard cement back out of old joints by hand, tooth by tooth, and repoint them once again in soft lime so the walls can finally breathe and flex the way their builders always meant them to. We are, quite literally, paying skilled experts to reverse the repairs of our own grandparents and put the medieval method back exactly where it was. The old masons are still teaching us, from 6 feet under, that we got the basics wrong. You can see the damage with your own eyes once you know what you are looking at. Walk slowly around an old church and find a stretch that was repointed in hard grey cement, its lines too neat and too proud, standing up out of the softer stone. Very often the stone right beside those cement joints is the worst on the whole building. Its surface blistered and powdering away, the carving blurred into a smear, while stone still bedded in the original lime a few feet along sights crisp and sound after 6 or 7 centuries. The cement did not save that stone. It pulled the decay toward itself and then drove it into the face beside it. The tidy modern repair and the ruined stone next to it are, again and again, the same story told in the same few decades, if you have the eyes to read it. And the lesson reaches far past old churches. Modern building science has spent the last few decades slowly rediscovering the very idea the medieval masons simply took for granted. That walls need to breathe. That sealing moisture inside a structure is how you quietly rot it from within. That a building is not a fortress that blocks water, but a system that has to let water find its way back out. We are relearning, with moisture sensors and laboratory rigs and long technical papers, something that was once just ordinary knowledge living in the hands of a man with a trowel and a pit of aged lime. He could not have explained a word of the chemistry, and he never needed to. He had watched enough walls live and enough walls die to know in his bones that soft, slow, and open beat hard, fast, and sealed over the only span of time that mattered to him, forever. The honest verdict is not that the medieval way was magic and the modern way is foolish, and it would be dishonest to pretend so. Lime and cement are simply two different answers to two different questions. If you are pouring the foundations of a skyscraper or the deck of a motorway bridge, you want cement, and lime would be laughable. But if you are caring for a building meant to stand for 1,000 years and to breathe along with its weather, then the medieval mason knew something we let ourselves forget. That hard is not the same word as durable. That a wall which can move and breathe and slowly turn itself back into stone will quietly outlast a wall that is merely strong. Strength stands and fights the world. What the medieval builder raised instead was a wall that made its peace with it. Which is exactly why, in the end, that mortar in the old church is still hardening while our concrete crumbles. It was never trying to win a fight against time. It was built to keep changing, gently, forever. A lump of burned rock tamed with water and then handed back to the open sky to become stone again on its own slow schedule. 800 years on, it is still not finished, and that unfinished, patient softness is the whole reason the wall is still standing over your head. Stand close to one of these old churches and put your hand flat against the wall. The stone is cool, the joints are soft and chalky under your fingers, and somewhere deep in there the slow reaction is still running. A little more rock forming this year than last, the way it has every year since before your language was fully born. That wall is not a finished object at all. It is a process that a medieval mason started and then walked away from, trusting the sky to complete it long after he was gone. The medieval masons did not leave us a stronger material. They left us a wiser one, and then they left us to work out, far too slowly, and at the cost of the buildings we loved most, what wise was even supposed to mean. If you want the real story behind old walls, subscribe and stay with us. Would you trust soft over strong now or not? Tell me below.